And I just remember the aroma in the morning on Shabbat, like opening that lid and having that just aroma of meat and potatoes and digging a spoon like deep into this like 4-inch high kugel and getting like a cross section of, really tender fall apart meat with this dark potatoy mixture that was just, perfectly oily, and I think sort of hit all the right notes for Shabbat.
Welcome to 18 Jewish Foods, Culture and History in Kosher Bite-Sized Portions. This podcast tells the stories of iconic Jewish dishes, shedding light on the people who eat them. Here's your host, Joel Haber.
In today's episode, I'm going to be looking at one of the most beloved foods in the Ashkenazi Jewish canon, although I would say that it has become absorbed somewhat into the broader Jewish food canon. But also I'm looking at a food that is very diverse and has a lot that we can learn from it. So this may be a bit of a longer episode than usual. I'm referring to Kugel, which essentially is a type of a casserole or pudding, as we'll discuss. And it is a starch base. Most common would be either noodles or potatoes, mixed with eggs and a fat of some kind. So originally, it would have been schmaltz. Nowadays, it's more frequently oil. These are mixed together and baked in a baking dish or a casserole tray. In between the World Wars, a French cook and food writer named Edouard de Pomian actually traveled to Poland and examined Jewish food. I say actually, highlighting the fact that de Pomian was not a Jew himself. He was just interested in Jewish cuisine. And in describing kugels, he points out that, quote, the chief characteristic of kugel dough is that it is a mixture of fat and flour without water. And that's the key thing he points out. If there were water involved, it would change the consistency and it would be a bit more like a cake, if you will. Gil Marx, in Encyclopedia of Jewish Food, points out that if it's missing one of those other core ingredients, it becomes a different type of a food than a kugel. It's a casserole or a quiche or a cake or something of that nature. The long history of kugel is rather complicated and interesting. It appears to have begun as a basic dumpling in Germany in the 12th century, basically simple dough or maybe even leftover stale bread that was mixed with a few other things, and then dropped or dumped, if you will, into the Shabbat stew to cook in the stew itself. But early on, people realized that it might taste good, but sometimes it falls apart. It's not necessarily the best consistency. And a innovation took place where that original dumpling was taken out of the stew itself and put into a smaller pot that was ball-shaped and open on top, and that pot was placed into the bigger stew pot. Now, a ball-shaped pot in German is known as a Kugeltopf. Kugel means ball, and so that is the origin of the name of the dish itself, the Kugel that was baked in a Kugeltopf. And the cooking method also changed because this dish started now to be steamed instead of stewing in the Shabbat stew. Of course, that meant it didn't get flavor from the Shabbat stew, and so the ingredients began to change, maybe more salt or pepper in there, some onions. Eventually, it started to be a dough that was not just a basic bread dough. The next major stage in the development doesn't take place until the 19th century. It is then that you start to have increasingly popular small home ovens. And so the kugel was able to emerge from the stew pot and be baked in the oven by itself outside of the cholent or other Shabbat stew. And that also freed it up to be eaten at other times. It didn't need to be eaten when you ate the Shabbat stew. It could be eaten on Friday night or even during the week, hypothetically. Interestingly, in Hungary, we see sort of a throwback where a basic dumpling is put into the Shabbat stew itself once again. And so it's kind of full circle back to the original kugel, and it has an entertaining name. It is known as the Shabbos Ganef, which means the Shabbat or Sabbath thief, because it steals the flavors of the Shabbat stew. Now, there are many, many different types of kugels in the world. The two most common are, first of all, a noodle, or in Yiddish, Lukshin kugel. Egg noodles started to become popular in Eastern Europe in the 15th century, and presumably soon after that began to be used as a base for a kugel. The other most popular is potato kugel. Typically grated potato. Some people make it with more of a mashed potato. This probably didn't really develop until the 19th century. It is only then, in the middle of the 19th century, that potatoes began to be eaten in massive quantities by Eastern European Jews. Other kinds would be a basic bread kugel, an apple kugel, a rice kugel. And back in episode 8, I described the Yerushalmi or Jerusalem kugel. This was a special type of noodle kugel that was developed in Jerusalem about 200 or so years ago with caramelized sugar and black pepper as the flavoring agents. In addition to the different types of kugels, there are also foods that are sort of ancillary to the kugel. For example, a very popular one in American Orthodox Jewry today is called yapchik. Yapchik is a potato kugel, but rather than just being your standard potato kugel, it sandwiches in the middle of it a fatty meat, usually flanken. And this bakes overnight on Shabbat again. And then you have sort of your potato kugel with this delicious fatty meat in the middle of it. Another ancillary food that my mother particularly likes is called potato nick, or in Yiddish, kartoffelnick. And this basically mixes a potato kugel with a yeasted bread type of a dough, and so it becomes sort of a cross between a kugel and a bread. When it comes to noodle kugel, there is a further breakdown between sweet and savory. Those Jews from Galicia, which is southeastern Poland and southwestern Ukraine, typically go for a more sweet, sugary type of a noodle kugel, whereas further north and east, if you go to Lithuania and parts of Russia, typically it would be more of a salt and pepper, savory type of a noodle kugel. This is not exclusive. My grandmother was a Galicianer, someone who was from Galicia, and yet her noodle kugel was not sweet. It had fried onions and salt and pepper, so it is not 100% exclusive, just a predominance. But this sweet, savory split and divide has been seen in many other Jewish Ashkenazic foods. For example, gefilte fish. Galicianers will typically add sugar into their gefilte fish, while Litvaks, those from Lithuania, would normally have pepper in theirs. I mentioned the idea of a pudding, and through the late 1800s and into the 1900s early, the most common English term for kugel was pudding. Now, this can be very confusing for American Jews because in America, the word pudding is typically associated just with a sweet milk-based food like chocolate pudding or vanilla pudding. In England, however, which was a big influence on the cooking of earlier American Jewry, pudding is a broader term. Yes, it can refer to the same thing as it does in America. It can also be a catch-all term for the dessert course in general, but there are many savory puddings as well. What basically differentiates the kugel from a casserole or other puddings is that it's much more solid, rather than a casserole that has a whole bunch of things cooked together, but it might not hold together as a single piece of food. But calling it a pudding is a way of Americanizing Jewish cuisine. This was pointed out in a thesis that was written by Avery Robinson, where he explores the entire concept of using the term pudding to refer to kugel. In fact, in the first Yiddish cookbook in America, published by Hinda Amchanatsky, she actually refers to kugel in Yiddish writing as a pudding. So it's an interesting side note to how this food became Americanized, something that I will discuss in the interview right now. I decided to speak with Adeena Sussman about kugel. Adeena is a well-known cookbook author who has co-authored 15 cookbooks, including a few best-selling cookbooks by Chrissy Teigen, and then also began to write her own. She had her wildly successful cookbook, Sababa, but I reached out to her about kugel because her follow-up to Sababa was the New York Times best-selling cookbook, Shabbat, Recipes and Rituals from My Table to Yours, which, of course, includes a number of Kugel recipes. In your cookbook Shabbat, like with many cookbooks, you separate your recipes into different sections. You have soups and salads and chicken and fish, whatever. But there were two foods that got their own section. One was the Shabbat stews, and the other was Kugel. What was it about Kugel that you felt made it warrant its own section in the book?
I think like cholent's Shabbat stews, sholet, tafin, adafinas, chamins, those are the foods, the Jewish foods that are most intertwined with Jewish halakha and tradition and Shabbat. Like they are made the way they're made often because of the rules that are associated with cooking for Shabbat. So I think those two categories, and specifically kugels as well, which often cook overnight or are pre-cooked, like really speak to the spirit of Shabbat and the proscriptions of cooking on the Sabbath.
There's a lot of foods around that in some way could be similar to a kugel. Like, for example, in Israel, we have the pashtida.
Yeah.
As a chef, as somebody who focuses on the creation of food itself, what do you see that differentiates kugel, if anything?
To me, kugels are like denser than pashtidot. I feel like they have like a soul food element to them, like a stick to your ribs kind of a personality. A pashtida, I feel like eggs can often be one of the star ingredients or not just a binder, and they can play a quiche-like role. And a kugel, I think the role of eggs is, if there are eggs, is to bind the other ingredients together, but they're not featured or highlighted in any way. Unless it's like a specific, very specific American dairy noodle kugel, which has a lot of eggs and dairy, and that's part of its personality. For the most part, like a Shabbat kugel is about the other ingredients that are designed to fill you up and to have an indulgent feeling and to be condensed into, the pan in which they're cooked.
You mentioned the American dairy sweet type of a kugel, which is something that I know I didn't grow up with.
Me neither.
First of all, I'm curious if you didn't. Okay, yeah.
We did. My mother made a sweet noodle kugel, but because we were kosher, and we ate meat also, before and after Yom Kippur, often Yom Kippur, so like it wasn't an option for us.
Right.
So my mother's sweet noodle kugel had raisins and pineapple and eggs, but no dairy. But I actually just recorded one for Shavuot.
What about the cornflakes?
We did not do cornflakes. Right.
Those are these. It's a very interesting thing how that combination of very distinctly American ingredients. We're talking about the cornflakes. We're talking about canned pineapple, cottage cheese, which maybe wasn't so distinctly American, but those are things that like entered the kugel in America, and to a certain degree that people think of it as the kugel in America.
I think that dairy noodle kugel speaks to a lot of different things that were going on in the United States, like the advent of convenience foods, like the idea of cornflake crumbs in a box, which is definitely a post-World War II invention, or even crushing up cereal like that. Pineapple, when it first was canned, and, Jewish people started using it in foods also in Simmus because it was considered a luxury item. And the cottage cheese, I think is, again, like a convenience food alternative to like farmer cheese, or what my grandmother called hoop cheese.
I've never heard that term.
I think because it was made in a barrel. So it like had a hoop shape.
Interesting.
My dairy noodle kugel, I take cottage cheese and blend it, sort of to approximate more like a farmer cheese texture.
So I'll end with, I know that much of your cooking in general, and especially the Shabbat stuff that you dealt with in the book, you have very strong connections to the home you grew up in and your mother and all of that. And I'm wondering if you could pick out if you have any memory of a special kugel memory from your childhood.
My grandmother called yapchik potato cholent, and she would hand grate many pounds of potatoes and, get really fatty flanken meat and onions. And she would make this kugel in a very specific magnolite pot, which is a pot that a lot of our grandmothers had.
Wasn't that like a heavy steel pot? Is that what it was? I can't remember.
I think it was more like heavy aluminum.
Okay.
Or some. It wasn't a heavy pot, but it's a very nice and solid pot. And it looks really nice. And it's in my Sababa cookbook, actually.
Okay.
But I remember it kind of blew my mind, like that she called potato kugel all of a sudden she called it potato cholent because she cooked it overnight with meat in it. And I just remember the aroma in the morning on Shabbat, like opening that lid and having that just aroma of meat and potatoes and digging a spoon like deep into this like 4-inch high kugel and getting like a cross section of, really tender fall apart meat with this dark potatoy mixture that was just, perfectly oily, and I think sort of hit all the right notes for Shabbat.
Rather than just focusing on kugel as an example of a Shabbat food, which I've already looked at a number of those in other episodes, here I want to use it to highlight a major segment and element of modern Judaism. I'm referring specifically to Jewish spirituality. Even more than Ashkenazi Jews in general, Chasidic Jews are obsessed with kugel. Alan Nadler, in an academic paper, Holy Kugel, highlights this obsession. For example, he talks of Hasidic Jews who tell you that you must go to the mikveh, the ritual bath, before eating kugel. Another source says that at the end of days when we pass away, they will weigh all of the kugel that we ate through our lives on the side of good. One of my favorite examples is that there's a Hasidic origin story for the word kugel, where they connect it with manna, the miraculous food that the Jews ate for 40 years in the desert. In the book of Exodus, it is described as being like white coriander seed, kazera gad lavan, and the acronym of the first letters of those three words spells out kugel. Obviously, this is not the literal or original source for the word kugel, but comparing this food to the miraculous manna shows how important it is in the Hasidic mind. But what do bearded men with sidelocks dressed in all black have to do with Jewish spirituality? To understand this, you need to look at the origins of the Hasidic movement. It all starts with Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. The ideas of Kabbalah had been around for centuries, but it really grows into popular awareness during the 16th century in the Israeli city of Tzfat, or Safed in English. It was there that many people really popularized Kabbalah and brought an awareness of it and its influence into broader Judaism overall. And part of that influence comes to the fore in the 18th century. In what is today Ukraine, a rabbi known by the nickname Baal Shem Tov, the master of a good name, began the Hasidic movement. And Hasidism at its core was a populist movement. For much of Jewish history, you had a split between the educated, scholarly elite and the ignorant masses. And Hasidism came about to empower those ignorant masses. It said, you don't need to be a Torah scholar to be able to worship God fully. You can do it just as well via everyday actions, like singing and dancing, and yes, via eating as well. One of the early core concepts in Hasidism is avodah begashmiut, or in Ashkenazic pronunciation, avodah begashmius, which means worshiping God via the physical or the mundane. Kabbalah believes that there are sparks of godliness in everything because God created everything, and therefore a piece of God is remaining in everything that was created. And one of our goals should be to elevate those sparks, separate them from the physical, and reconnect them with God. This is one of the early concepts. We see this from the writings of the Baal Shem Tov's main student, Rav Yaakov Yosef of Polon, who writes in the first published Hasidic work that how do we reunite the sparks? Via, quote, eating and drinking, sexual relations, business dealings, and all mundane acts between him and his fellow human. And I will point out that eating is the first one mentioned, even before sex, which we might think would be the most physical, and that if we can elevate that, that would be the best. But since eating is something we do every single day, multiple times a day, there is no better example of a physical act that we can elevate via the right mindset. And that actually is a key, because having the right mindset is the important element in elevating those sparks. But what is said is that even if you don't have the right intentions, the foods that you eat on Shabbat will elevate those sparks anyway because of the power of that holy day. Of all of the Shabbat foods, however, Kugel became the most imbued with meaning and custom in the Hasidic mind. And that's because it was the most popular of all of the Shabbat foods. So what better way to express this idea of adding spirituality into the mundane than through the most common of the foods? Furthermore, it's a genuinely Jewish food. As Nadler also points out, there was an 18th century Christian text that warned of people eating Kugel and other Jewish foods. This shows that the Christians considered Kugel to be specifically a Jewish food. We also see its popularity via Yiddish folk expressions. For example, a non-Jewish idea that superficially has kind of a Jewish coding to it is called Kugel mit Chaserschmalz, which means Kugel with lard. Somebody who converted or assimilated, but didn't do such a good job and couldn't really blend in with the non-Jews, people said that you could see the Kugel on his face. Nadler also highlights that Kugel and other Shabbat foods became even more important as Hasidism itself changed. In the 19th century, the Hasidic movement shifted somewhat from its populist origins to being a little bit more elitist, elevating the role of the Rebbe, the leader of each Hasidic group. And this led to a hyper focus on whatever he ate and how he ate it, and particularly to Kugel. So what we see is how the early Hasidic movement was actually a major entry point for Jewish spirituality, and it has reached a point where spirituality is a part of every single Jewish movement today. But Hasidic movement brought about the idea of inserting song and dance into your worship, mysticism, and the general idea of worship via our daily lives. This may be surprising for those who see the Hasidic movement and the Jewish spirituality movement as so vastly different, but in reality, they're not as different as they seem. In the next episode, I will be speaking with David and Dorit Namias, and we will be discussing a genuinely Jewish alcoholic beverage, machia. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed. Got any questions or comments? Please feel free to email me at jewishfoodbook@gmail.com. Please listen, like, and follow wherever you get your podcasts, and I would truly appreciate it if you'd share this with other Jewish food lovers. The theme music you hear is Adirhu Revisited by Rebbe Soul. Check him out wherever you stream music. And as always, until next time, I wish you B'tei Avon.